Welcome to Darshan Talks, powered by the Kulkarni law firm.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm here with the ever-popular Istvan today to talk a little bit about the types of clinical trial agreements. There are all these different types of clinical trial agreements, which as a site or a sponsor, you may not even be aware of. So stay tuned, listen in. But before we go on, Ish, tell us more about yourself.
Thank you for having me, Darshan. As always, Istvan Fekete. Please feel free to call me Ish. That's what most everybody else does. Been in the clinical trial agreement negotiating game for over a decade now. Ran the contracts team at University of Chicago for a number of years, and now I work for Huron Consulting, where we help sites with their clinical trial agreement needs.
Wonderful, Ish. So, Ish, tell us a little bit about the types of clinical trial agreements. First, let's just sort of speak of them at an overall perspective before we do a deeper dive.
So I think we start with the industry sponsor side of the house, and that is where the pharmaceutical company is the regulatory sponsor of the study. They hold the IND or they hold the IDE.
So we'll do the details in a few seconds. If you just want to name the types first.
Oh, sure. So there's industry sponsored trials. Now within industry sponsor, you have some other buckets. You have registry studies, and then you have phase 4 post-market long-term follow-up studies. So that's the industry sponsored side. And then of course you have drug and device studies on that side of the house. Then you have federally funded studies. A lot of clinical trials are funded through like NIH grants. And so there's a lot of federal funding mechanisms that support clinical trials. Then you have all your consortium clinical trials where a specific consortium has sites in it. They negotiate an agreement and then subcontract that to all their sites. Then you also have the investigator-initiated bucket of trials, and that is where an investigator at a site or at a consortium wrote the protocol. And for a site, there's kind of two flavors of that. There's one where your investigator wrote the protocol and you're the lead site. And then there's one where an investigator at another institution wrote the protocol and they're subcontracting that to your site.
So far we've gotten, well, close to about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or more types of clinical trials. Let's start with the vanilla of all of them, which is your typical industry sponsored clinical trial. Let's talk about the ones that are doing the phase 1 through phase 3s. So what most people think about. And first of all, let's talk about phase 1 to phase 3s. Is there a difference in the type of negotiation you would do in a phase 1 versus a phase 3?
Phase 1 is going to have potentially or arguably, depending on which word you want to use, more risk than a phase 3, obviously, right? By the time you've gone to phase 3, you've done a lot more safety and efficacy and tolerability testing than you have in phase 1. So in phase 1, a perspective a site can take is they'll be more stringent in terms of how lenient they'll be regarding indemnification and subject injury. Now, in real world practical terms, most sites have the same standard for those things, phase 1 through phase 3. The other nuance you see out there is sometimes on phase 1 studies, some sites will take the perspective that IP is more likely to arise there than in a phase 2 or a phase 3 study. So they will maybe be more stringent about the IP rights that they would grant to the sponsor. But again, I would say that is more atypical. Most sites will have the same IP standards, phase 1 through 3.
I think you're overall right. I would actually add one more piece to it. I think the types of sites that get chosen for a phase 1 are probably slightly different from phase 3. Even though they may land up using the same exact facilities, I think as a sponsor, what you start thinking about is a phase 1 is, as you're pointing out, more inherently risky. So you want to make sure that the site has escalation mechanisms. So you'll often try to work with academic medical centers, or you'll try to work with larger hospitals because you can use the ER and the like if necessary.
This, because I haven't worked on the sponsor side, but I would imagine that, you know, the speed is more important, is the most important in phase one. And what I mean is speed to activation. So in addition for looking for sites that have all the, you know, administrative regulatory mechanisms to comply, do sponsors also consider time to activation for sites as they're deciding who their phase one sites are going to be?
So the truth is they should. The reality is that they don't really have any way of knowing that, because unless you are a large sponsor who's worked with these sites before, you are typically a small to mid-sized sponsor who doesn't know enough. So you're coming in there going, well, I assume everyone works really quickly. And reality is often different. So it's just a lack of knowledge in many cases. The other part of it is which type of CRO are you working with? You'll have your large PPDs of the world who are amazing at a lot of things that they do. However, they may not be specialists. And then you'll have sort of your specialty CROs who are working and have knowledge in rare disease states. And they may have access to certain types of doctors. So in those cases, depending on who you chose as a sponsor, you may have someone who has access to certain rare disease state patients, but that means that you're working with a smaller site. And if you're working with a smaller site, that activation time may be affected. So it all comes down to the type of product you're working with, the types of people you're working with. But overall, I think it should be a consideration. As we've pointed out in a previous podcast, it's not as much of a consideration as it should be. So keep that in mind as well. But that raises this interesting question, which is, if you are a site and you are trying to get into, I mean, I think most sites, it's fair to say, will probably start from your phase 2s and the phase 3s. Do you find many sites saying, I want to go into phase 1s, or do you find most saying I'd rather get into phase 4 and back myself into 1 later on because the risk is too high?
It really kind of depends on the institution and what kind of PIs they have there. There are some institutions where one of the primary tenets of their model is to do a ton of phase 1 and really strive to be the first patient in the clinic type of sites, right? And so there are sites that are set up and put a lot of focus on being that phase 1 first patient in the clinic site. And then there are other sites that do tend to do more phase 3 and phase 4. And, you know, I don't know if it's hard to tell. Sometimes it's because of risk tolerance, but sometimes it's just because of the PIs that they have present and kind of the goals of the leadership of their, you know, medical school, right? And so there's more human nuance in, you know, what the goals of the site are in that regard than I would have assumed prior to working in the industry.
So we've explored phase 1 through 3 a little bit. We talked a little bit about the types of clinical trial agreements, what there might be in terms of tonal differences, and we'll come back to factors that affect clinical trials, hopefully in the next podcast. But as it stands, the next type was phase 4s, post-marketing. We talked a little bit about that. We explained it as post-marketing. Talk to me a little bit about how the negotiation for a phase 4 is different from, say, a phase 3.
So phase 4, the product is FDA approved and you are using it in the study according to standard of care. And you are generally not getting the product from the sponsor, you're getting it commercially, right? Because you are just using it and prescribing it as you normally would, whether the clinical trial existed or not. And the point of it is to do long-term follow-up with patients who are on the drug, right? Where are they at 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Of being on this drug. And so we also mentioned registry studies, which are just data collection studies. And that's really what phase 4 are, is data collection. Now, where the nuance comes in is if you add an extra blood draw to your protocol in a phase 4 study that the patient would not have undergone but for their participation in that phase 4 study, that study is now interventional. Yes, we understand that the likelihood of injuries from a blood draw are minimal and whatever, but guess what? If I have interventional research procedures in my phase 4 study, I'm asking for full indemnification. I'm asking for full subject injury coverage. So be aware of that. There's phase 4, and then there's phase 4 where there's been interventional research components added to it, not in the administration of the drug, but things like an additional blood draw and things of that nature.
Now, what you point out is a really, really important thing because it talks to things like indemnification, but it may also affect reimbursement, for example. The big question that I have is, would the typical site negotiator know that this is not standard of care, that this is this specific blood draw is actually being requested at the behest of the sponsor, but it would not constitute standard of care?
99.99% of your contract negotiators are not going to know this unless they can read a Medicare coverage analysis and, read the schedule of events in a protocol and figure it out from that. Sometimes you can tell from the ICF, right? The ICF is written in simple language, and if the patient is exposed to risk that they would not be, but for participation in the trial, the ICF will generally do that. But what I really do, what I recommend to people to do is contact your study team and ask them the question, are all procedures in this trial truly interventional? And they will tell you, yes, except for this blood draw, yes, except for this additional EKG, whatever the interventional component, they will know because they have to be familiar with the protocol and the schedule of events. So I recommend phase 4 studies. If you're going to forgo your standard subject injury and indemnification, vet with your study team that everything is truly standard of care.
I find that interesting because you seem to be working with a wider variety of sites than I am, in that the variety of sites I work with, they typically don't start looking at the protocol until the CTA is signed, or at least they don't want to. So because they don't want to spend the energy until they know they're going to be paid for it. So they wouldn't typically know if something is standard of care until they're forced to look at it. So would you say that it is a good idea to actually have that happen early on because of exactly these types of issues? And have you had pushback from sites saying, why am I spending this time if I don't even know if I'm doing the study yet?
I have an opinion about the right way to do this, but I want to preface this. This is one man's opinion. I'm just a guy in a room. But I think the appropriate way to do this is to have a feasibility group. That when you as a site are contemplating participating in a clinical trial, you evaluate it from a feasibility perspective. Do we have the patient population for this? Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the available resources to do this study at this point in time? If the answer to that is yes, that is your due diligence. Instead of waiting for the clinical trial agreement to be signed, that's your due diligence that we as an institution want to do this. And so we're going to invest resources into making this happen. And then at that point, I believe in the concurrent routing process, is that your contract should be provided to the contract people, your budget should be provided to the budget people, and your protocol should be provided to the IRB all at the same time. So we're working on the budget, IRB approval, contract all at the same time. And what that does is it allows you to do things like vet with the IRB that the ICF is going to match the subject injury language while you're negotiating the contract, right? And things of that nature that you can line up, including this that we're talking about, what is actually happening in the protocol.
I find that fascinating because I totally see your viewpoint from a contractor standpoint for someone who's negotiating these contracts, but the number of agreements that fall through, the number of the amount of resources it takes for a lot of the smaller sites. I think the difference is the types of sites we might negotiate for.
They're not doing appropriate feasibility on the front end, right? Because
I would argue they aren't.
Right. If you do
aspirational many times.
Yeah. And you say we can do this, then, in my 10 years how many industry-sponsored clinical trial agreement deals have I seen fall through? Under 1%. I
Really?
mean, yeah, I mean, most of the time it falls through from the perspective of like the sponsor has hit enrollment targets, while you're working on the trial. Now, what also happens a lot is the site opens a trial and then doesn't enroll anybody, right?
Right.
That's
Right.
also a problem with your feasibility assessment, right? That means you don't have a good handle on what your patient population actually is, right? Or how good of an enroller this PI has proven to historically be. Now, I had a PI make an interesting argument to me about trials that they opened that they never enrolled patients in. And they said, I get what you're saying, but I want to have the option. If I have a patient that comes in and I think they would be a good fit for this trial, I want to have the option to be able to enroll them. And I get that from a doctor's perspective, right? But then what you're talking about, does it really make sense for the institution to invest all these resources in studies that don't happen, or that when they do happen, you don't enroll anybody?
And again, from the sponsor perspective, putting in all that money to only find out that they may not have the patients. I would argue to the doctor, I love the fact that you're taking care of your patients and you're looking out for your patients. However, you could just as easily have that patient go to a site that does have the study, that has a mix of patients that, number one, that physician is more conversant with the actual protocol because they're looking at it day in and day out, theoretically. Or at least their study staff is more conversant with, as opposed to you who's going to read it this one time for this one patient. So I love the concept. I love the academic thought of this, but I feel like, as you and I are pointing out, there is the reality for the smaller sites, there's the reality for the larger sites, and then there's a reality for the sponsor. And all of them are real. Is just what viewpoint you come from, which is why I think this is fascinating.
I mean, sponsors do their own feasibility, which I think is also important, because you got to remember, all those startup fees are not refundable, right? And so if you're paying startup fees, but you're not getting patient enrollment on the back end, you've accomplished nothing but wasted money.
So the funny part is you'll see sponsors do feasibility analyses, but my experience has been that, I've seen some of the contracts negotiated basically say that we'll get some of the feasibility analysis money back in the startup fees, for example. However, reality is you can't really go chasing these same doctors, because they're going to make an argument that we spent the money, and you really don't want to piss off the doctors who probably land up prescribing your product at the end. So It's not worth it. But at the same time, with kickback becoming a real issue, you have to be aware of where you're spending the money, not because it's a huge issue, but because you don't want to be accused of anti-kickback violations and compliance violations after the fact. So
Sure.
we talked a little bit about phase 4s. You hinted at registry studies. Could you talk a little bit about what they are? How are they different from phase 4 studies?
So registry studies, it's truly non-interventional. It's just data collection. A lot of the times it's retrospective data collection, meaning we want these data points on all the patients who hit this criteria. Sometimes it's prospective data collection, right? That when you conduct these standard of care procedures and you're collecting this data, send us, X, Y, and Z. And so it's really about the pharmaceutical company creating a database of patients who have used their product, where they can analyze, certain variables and certain data points. So it's an interesting thing, because registry studies are not clinical trial agreements by the way the FDA defines a clinical trial agreement. They're really exercises in data collection. And if you look at how academic medical centers are set up, they have indirect cost rates, right? And the indirect cost rate that they charge for something like corporate sponsored research is much higher than the indirect cost rate that they charge for a registry study. Now, the logic is, the reason indirect cost rates are lower on the hospital side is because of the space that the studies are conducted in, right? Meaning that the hospital lights are already going to be on regardless if you're conducting the clinical trial agreement or not. Whereas on the corporate sponsored research side, you ain't only maybe turning the light on in the lab because you're doing that research in collaboration with that company. But I always thought it was interesting how registry studies fell into the bucket of being processed like clinical trial agreements on the site side, because when you look at the actual scope of work, it's really closer to what's going on the corporate research side of things. But I get the logic because it's the same space, same people who are doing the clinical trial agreements.
And then we talked a little bit about, I don't want to dig too much because I feel like we're taking too long in each specific one, but let's go through these a little bit more faster. You talked about drug and device trials. Do you negotiate them differently?
I think there's nuance in the device trials. You know, are you purchasing the device? Are you getting it for free? You know, is it a category A device? Is it a category B device, right? Those pose different type of risk paradigms to the site. So I think there is some nuance on the device side of things, because it's not always a scenario where the sponsor is giving it to you for free. And these devices can be very expensive sometimes. So there is some nuance on the device side of things for sure.
Very, very cool. You then talked about federally funded research, NIH grants and the like. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the times the way this works is a PI writes a protocol, applies to the government to fund it, gets that money, and then subcontracts performance of that protocol to other sites. What's the most interesting thing to me about this is historically, you know, these projects haven't had clinical trial agreement terms. They've been just like grant-ish terms. And like people have just been like, well, yeah, there's an experimental drug, but it's federally funded. So like whatever, you know, and there was kind of this attitude that like federally funded was special because it was federally funded. And it's true. You're never getting subject injury. You're never getting indemnification under those things, right? You're going to have to assume that risk. But there has been a shift where the federal demonstration partnership has come out with the clinical trial agreement subcontract template that now the sites can use to subcontract to each other. So that has been a big help, because before clinical trial, you know, social science research, the contract looked exactly the same.
I find it fascinating because I think in the context of federally funded studies, they tend to be more prestigious. So since they are more prestigious, you'll see larger academic medical centers, who I do represent as well, they're willing to take on that risk because they get to put in their publicity. We received a $5 million NIH grant, and that's worth way more than the $5 million that they're actually getting, because there'll be more patients who come in and they'll say it's a prestigious place because Dr. Smith is getting this grant and I want to work with Dr. Smith. But I think jumping to the next one, so we talked about, well, before we jump to the next one, let's sort of summarize. We've got the industry sponsored, which is your phase 1 through phase 3, but then you've also got your phase 4 post-market, dividing again drug device. You've got another variety there. You've got your registry studies. We talked a little bit about federal funding. I do also want to point out that there has been over the last 2 or 3 years, more and more compliance issues popping up around research fraud, especially in the context of federally funded research. So keep an eye out for that if you're in that space. There are large academic medical centers that have been that have had settlements because of these types of issues. So keep that in mind. That brings us to consortium. What are consortium studies?
So there's a lot of groups out there that focus on a specific type of disease. And they want to create a mechanism by which it's easier to activate trials among the sites that share an interest in curing that disease, right? So for instance, you may see a consortium around multiple myeloma. And what will happen is the consortium will create a contractual template. And if the pharmaceutical company is willing to leverage that contractual template, then it's goals like this, boom, you get access to 20 sites right away when you sign that contractual template with the consortium. So it's meant to be a mechanism to more quickly activate clinical trials. And I'll give one piece of advice to the consortiums out there. When you're creating your templates, the best way to do this is to bring the pharmaceutical partners and to bring the sites into a room and have them work out a template that will be agreeable to both of them. Because if you only have one site helping you create your consortium's template, then when you try to issue your subcontracts, you're going to get a lot of pushback. Or when you send the sponsor your template that was only written from the site perspective, you're going to get a lot of pushback. So the best way to do this is to bring everybody to the table and create a template that we can all use moving forward.
I love it. I love that little piece of feedback. How do you see consortiums as being different from what are often maligned as SMOs or site management organizations?
I think consortiums, that's a good question. I mean, they're not involved in site operations. They're not representatives of the site, right? Where SMOs are. They're simply a mechanism to more quickly advance the research on the particular disease, right? And so they do their own philanthropic fundraising. They get a lot of federal funding depending on the structure of the consortium. And it's really meant to just be a mechanism where it's like, we want to cure juvenile diabetes, okay? So you sign this contract with our consortium and you get access to the 10 biggest juvenile diabetes research sites in the country right away, right? And so it's really meant to be a kind of accelerator mechanism more so than anything related to site management.
Now, are consortium trials funded by the sponsor, or are they actually funded by, or is the protocol, et cetera, designed by the investigators?
It can be every which way you think about it. So it can be a situation where it is pharma sponsored, the phase 1 through 3 that we talked about. It can be a situation where the consortium itself wrote the protocol and is the regulatory sponsor of the study. It can be a situation where one of the PIs in the consortium wrote the protocol and their site, and that PI is the actual regulatory sponsor of the study, but it will be conducted through the consortium so they could have quick access to all these sites, right? Now, in terms of funding, the pharmaceutical companies will provide funding generally in most of these instances, right? Whether it's their study, whether it's an investigator-initiated study, sometimes you have situations, which is pretty nice for the pharmas, where it's like philanthropic or government funding that's funding it, and all they have to do is contribute their product. And so you see scenarios like that. So it's really a consortium, they pool resources from a bunch of different places to make that study a reality. So it can be a multitude of flavors in terms of what it looks like.
Are you seeing consortium studies for non-FDA approved products, or are they for not for products that have a secondary use? I'm actually saying for essentially a startup. So let's say I'm a startup company, has a product that's never been FDA approved for any indication. Do you typically see them coming up to a consortium and saying, help us?
Mainly you see the big pharmas playing in the consortium box.
Right.
Why that is, I think part of it is the smaller companies have much more concern about IP, because a lot of these consortium studies are combination therapies, okay? Or they'll be set up where the patient can hop to different arms, and each arm there's a different drug provided by a different company, right? And so once you get into that realm, guess what? There could be IP related to 2 drugs, right? Who owns that IP? Guess what, companies? Y'all are going to have to split ownership of that because each one of your products are involved, right? And so I think those type of considerations are ones that the larger players are more willing to kind of risk and grapple through than smaller players. I don't know that to be a fact. That's just, my assumption living in the space.
Yeah. And then it brings us to the ever popular investigator-initiated studies. And there are 2 varieties. You mentioned the investigator-initiated studies that are primarily by your PI, and some situations where another PI designed the study and you're a sub-I or you are a different site running the study. So could you talk a little bit more about IIRs, or investigator-initiated research?
Yeah, so a PI at one of the sites wrote the protocol. They're going to be the regulatory sponsor, their institution holder of the IND or IDE with the FDA, and they're going to go out and they're going to get money and or drug from pharma, from nonprofits, from the federal government, whatever it is. And then they're going to subcontract that funding and that use of that drug and that protocol to other sites to perform it. And I think the biggest issue in this space is on the site side, and that is this what's good for the goose is good for the gander kind of thinking, where when the site is the lead site on the study, they want to be treated like a sponsor by the other academic sites, in that we own the IP you create, we own the data that you create, and you get a license to it just like you would on an industry-sponsored trial,
right,
because we're the sponsor, you're the performance site. But what will happen, then that same site will be a subcontractor to somebody else's investigator-initiated study, and then
right,
all of a sudden, what they were asking for when they were the prime site no longer works for them on the back end. And so
right,
my recommendation is to be aware of this. And I would also say, and your investigator-initiated studies, you're never getting subject injury, okay? So when you're doing somebody else's investigator-initiated study, guess what? You're never getting subject injury. So go into that eyes wide open. Don't pretend like there's an opportunity there for you to get it.
I love that practical feedback. I do also want to emphasize that all of these still have the risk of being, most of these, outside the federally funded ones, have the risk of also being considered to be seeding trials. So that's something that the DOJ looks out for from a fraud and compliance standpoint. So the idea being that pharma's using these studies not to actually discover the answer, but to actually pay money to doctors. And that can come up in ways where doctors are being told, oh yeah, this is a 4-person study. Well, you're going to learn nothing from a 4-person study. So why are you doing it? Well, because we're paying the doctor $2,500 per patient. That's a $10,000 payment I can give to the doctor. Well, you better have a really good rationale for it. So it's something that sponsors need to be aware of. So keep that in mind as you continue. The DOJ has been actively pointing out in 2021, so that's not that long ago, the Department of Justice said that clinical research is an area that they are focusing more and more attention on. So when you're negotiating these agreements, make sure you as a sponsor are cognizant of the money you're giving to sites. If you are a site, it is also in your best interest to give money back if you are getting it from sponsors inappropriately, because yes, it may show up on the Sunshine Act, and that by itself is not something that a lot of sites worry about. The part I think a lot of sites worry about is, or should worry about, is when the DOJ goes back and looks at the data 5 years down the road, and then Monday morning quarterbacks and goes, well, why was this there? And sites may not even remember, but this comes back to haunt you after the fact. So keep track of that as well. But Ish, this was amazing. This was incredible. Before we go, any last words?
No, I would just like to say thank you for having me. Always love my time on the podcast. So just really appreciate it.
Thank you again, Ish.